Mountain Man never had visitors until a naked, obese bride suddenly appeared begging at his door. In the heart of a snow-choked wilderness, a reclusive frontiersman lives alone, speaking to no one but his hound and the wind. Then, one storm-torn night, the unthinkable happens. A desperate woman shivering, stripped of dignity, pounds at his cabin door, pleading for her life. He lets her in. But when the firelight reveals the truth, the mountain man's world is shattered. She carries a marriage paper that bears his own name. By law and by oath, she is his wife, but the town mocks her. A ruthless rancher claims her dowry, and behind it all lies a secret forged in lies and betrayal. As church bells toll and rifles are cocked, one question rises louder than the storm. Will this hardened loner defend the woman Providence placed at his door, or lose her to the cruel hands of men who see her only as a prize? This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The wind howled like a wounded beast against the cabin walls. Daniel Boone sat in his wooden chair, staring into the dancing flames of his hearth. His faithful hound dozed at his feet, twitching now and then in some dream of summer rabbits. The mountain man's weathered hands absently stroked his beard as memories of town life flickered through his mind like the shadows on the wall. 10 years of solitude had worn smooth the sharp edges of those old hurts, the whispered lies, the stolen contracts, the friends who'd turned their backs. Up here in the highlands, at least the dangers were honest. A bear would look you in the eye before it killed you. The sudden pounding at his door made both man and dog jump. 3 sharp strikes that barely carried over the storm's fury. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but something in the desperate rhythm spoke of terror rather than threat. "Who goes there?" he called out, voice rough from disuse. Only the wind answered, then another series of weaker knocks. The hound whined, nose pointed toward the door. Daniel rose, muscles tense, and drew back the heavy wooden bar. The storm burst in with explosive force, driving needles of snow and a massive shape that collapsed across his threshold. Daniel's eyes widened as he made sense of what lay before him: a woman, stripped bare as the day she was born, her large frame blue-white with cold. "Lord have mercy," he breathed, instantly dropping to his knees beside her. Her flesh was like ice beneath his hands as he rolled her clear of the door and kicked it shut. She was breathing, but barely, her lips tinged an alarming shade of purple dot, moving with the swift efficiency of one used to wilderness emergencies. Daniel grabbed his prized buffalo robe from its peg and wrapped it around her substantial form. He half carried, half dragged her closer to the fire, propping her up against his chair. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, deep brown, filled with terror and exhaustion. "Hold on now," he murmured, though gentleness felt foreign on his tongue. He hurried to the pot of soup that had been simmering on his hearth, ladling some into a tin cup. The hound pressed close, lending his warmth to the stranger as Daniel carefully helped her drink. After several sips, color began returning to her face. Her violent shivering gradually eased as the buffalo robe and fire did their work. When she could speak, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Sophia Whitlow," she managed between chattering teeth. "Daniel Boone," he replied gruffly. "What in heaven's name happened to you, woman?" Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the robe tighter. "The marriage party, she swallowed hard. "I came west as a mail-order bride. But when they saw how big I was," a sob caught in her throat. "They laughed, called me awful names, said no man would want. Daniel's jaw clenched as understanding dawned. "They did this to you? Left you to freeze?" She nodded, shame burning in her cheeks despite the cold. "Stripped me of everything. Said if I was so eager to find a husband, I could try my luck in the wilderness." Fresh tears spilled down her round face. I wandered for hours in the storm. When I saw your chimney smoke, please, she begged, reaching out to clutch his sleeve. Let me stay, just until morning. I'll die out there alone. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin as his mind raced. Having an unchaperoned woman in his home overnight, it would be scandal enough to undo his careful years of isolation if anyone found out. But the alternative? He looked down at her trembling form, at the trust and desperation in her eyes. You'll stay, he said finally, his voice rough. At least until this storm passes. I'm not the sort to cast anyone out to freeze, no matter what troubles might come of it. Relief flooded her face. Thank you, she whispered. God bless you, Mr. Boone. He grunted uncomfortably at the blessing and moved to gather more blankets. As he layered them around her, his hound settled its head in her lap with a contented sigh. Daniel watched the woman's hand automatically move to scratch behind the dog's ears, and something twisted in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. The storm raged on outside, but in the cabin's warmth, Sophia's eyes were already growing heavy with exhaustion. Daniel added another log to the fire and settled into the corner with his rifle across his knees. He told himself it was to guard against any followers who might come looking for sport. But as he watched her drift into uneasy sleep, he knew he was really standing guard against the ghosts of civilization that had wounded them both so deeply. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands, but the storm showed no sign of mercy. Snow whipped against the cabin's small window, the glass rattling with each fierce gust. Inside, the fire's warm glow cast dancing shadows on the log walls as Daniel added another piece of split pine to the flames. Sophia sat wrapped in quilts near the hearth, her large frame still trembling despite the warmth. Her frostbitten hands lay palms up in her lap as Daniel carefully spread bear grease over the angry red flesh. The silence between them stretched thin as morning light. I answered an advertisement, she began softly, her voice catching. In the Kansas City paper. A man seeking a Christian wife to help manage his Colorado homestead. She swallowed hard, watching Daniel's rough hands tend to hers with surprising gentleness. We exchanged letters for 2 months. He wrote such kind things about wanting a woman with a good heart, said looks didn't matter none. Daniel grunted, keeping his eyes on his work. The hound pressed closer to Sophia's feet, sensing her distress. The preacher married us by proxy. 3 weeks ago. I sold everything I owned to pay for the journey west. Tears slid down her round cheeks. When I stepped off the stage in Denver, there was a group of men waiting. They took one look at me and started laughing, called me. She shook her head, unable to repeat the cruel words. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, reaching for more bear grease. They said the real groom had run off, leaving gambling debts behind. They thought it great sport to, her voice broke, to strip me bare and chase me into the storm. Said maybe the mountains would make me smaller. The bear grease jar cracked in Daniel's grip. He set it down carefully, his weathered face dark with controlled anger. Sophia's hands trembled as she reached into the folds of the buffalo robe. I managed to keep hold of this, she whispered, producing the folded paper, creased and damp but intact. The marriage certificate. Daniel took it with reluctance, unfolding the document in the firelight. His eyes widened as he read, then narrowed. Dangerously. There, in clear black ink, was his own name, Daniel Boone, signed by Reverend Thomas Walsh of Denver City 3 weeks prior. Some stranger used my name, he said, voice rough as mountain granite, to escape his debts and leave. You bearing the consequences. Sophia nodded, watching his face anxiously. The law says we're truly married, she said softly, though neither of us chose it. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin like a caged bear. The hound's eyes followed his movement, ears perked with concern. Outside, the wind howled its sympathy. Maybe, Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe Providence had a hand in bringing me to your door. Of all the cabins in these mountains, I found the very one." She trailed off, dropping her gaze to her raw hands. Daniel stopped his pacing, staring into the fire as if it might hold answers. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood. Finally he spoke, his words measured and careful. "You can stay until spring," he said gruffly. "These mountains are no place for anyone alone in winter. But we'll live separate as strangers under this roof. Whatever that paper says, I didn't choose this marriage, and neither did you." Sophia nodded, accepting his terms with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. I won't be a burden." As if to prove her words, she began to sing softly, an old hymn that seemed to rise naturally from her heart. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger, filling the cabin with unexpected warmth. Daniel meant to return to his chair in the corner, to maintain the distance he'd declared, but something in her voice held him there by the fire. The familiar words of the hymn stirred memories he'd thought long buried, of church pews and Sunday meetings, of community and faith he'd left behind. He found himself sinking back down onto the hearth, pretending to tend the fire while Sophia's clear voice lifted above the storm's rage. Her face glowed in the firelight, a quiet strength emerging through her fear and shame. Despite himself, Daniel felt the walls around his heart shift ever so slightly. Like spring ice beginning to crack, the snow continued to pile higher on the cabin as the days stretched on, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness. Inside, Daniel realized they needed a system for sharing the confined space. He gestured around the single room, his movements stiff and uncertain. "Main room here," he said gruffly. "Loft up there for sleeping, you can take it. I'll bed down." By the fire, he pointed to various corners. Tools hanging there, food stores in them barrels. Lean-tos out back, stacked with firewood. Sophia nodded, taking in every detail with keen eyes. Her large frame moved carefully through the space, as if trying to make herself smaller. But when Daniel mentioned supper, she straightened with purpose. "Let me help with the cooking," she offered. "I notice your beans could use some tending." Before he could object, she was already at the pot hanging over the fire, stirring the contents with practiced movements. The aroma that soon filled the cabin made Daniel's stomach growl appreciatively. Later that evening, she spotted his pile of torn shirts and reached for her travel bag. "I've got needle and thread," she said quietly. "If you don't mind?" Daniel shrugged, but watched with growing interest as her thick fingers moved with surprising delicacy, mending tears and reinforcing worn seams. The firelight caught the silver flash of her needle, dipping and rising like a tiny fish in a stream. The next morning, Sophia was up before dawn. Daniel woke to find her fashioning curtains from spare cloth he'd forgotten he had. She hung them carefully over the single window, and suddenly the dim cabin seemed brighter, more alive. "Ain't much," she said, smoothing the rough fabric, "but it helps keep the cold from seeping through the glass." Daniel grunted in response, but found his eyes drawn to the simple curtains throughout the day. They stirred gently in the draft, adding movement to the still cabin air. It had been years since anyone but him had shaped this space, and the change unsettled him even as it brought unexpected comfort. Nights were the hardest. After supper, silence would fall heavy between them, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the howl of wind. Daniel would pretend to whittle by the fire, while Sophia sat wrapped in quilts, her lips moving in silent prayer. The familiar words of the Lord's Prayer sometimes carried faintly to his ears, stirring memories of his mother's voice, of church pews and community gatherings he'd long since abandoned. One evening, he caught himself mouthing the words along with her, "Give us this day our daily bread." He stopped abruptly when she glanced his way, but something had shifted in his chest. Like ice breaking up in spring. After a week of constant snowfall, the storm finally broke. The morning sun burst through the curtained window, setting the snow-covered landscape ablaze with light. Daniel found Sophia pressing her face to the glass like a child. "Would you like to see it proper?" he asked hesitantly. "Just for a spell, mind. It's bitter cold still." Sophia's face lit up. Daniel helped wrap her in his spare coat, which barely closed around her, and led her carefully through the deep snow to a spot behind the cabin. Here, the land fell away sharply, revealing the vast panorama of the Colorado highlands, snow-laden. Pines marched down the mountainside into a valley filled with morning mist. Beyond, peaks stretched to the horizon, their jagged tops gleaming like polished silver in the sun. The sky arched overhead, a blue so deep and clear it seemed close enough to touch. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, it's glory itself." She took a step forward to see better, but her foot slipped on the icy ground. Daniel's arm shot out instantly, catching her waist. She clutched at his coat, pressing against him for balance, and for a moment they stood frozen like that, sharing warmth in the crystal morning air. Then Daniel carefully set her upright and stepped back, his face flushing above his beard. "Best get to my chores," he muttered, striding to the woodpile. Soon the rhythmic thunk of his axe filled the air as he split logs with more force than necessary. Sophia stood watching the view a moment longer, one hand pressed to her chest where her heart still raced from the near fall, or perhaps from something else. Then she turned and made her way carefully back to the cabin, leaving small impressions in the snow that filled slowly with shadows as the sun climbed higher. Inside, she began preparing breakfast, stealing glances through the curtained window at Daniel's steady work. Neither spoke of the moment they'd shared, but both felt the change in the air between them, subtle as a shift in the wind, promising as the sun after storm. The weather finally broke enough for Daniel to check his traplines. The morning sun glinted off the snow as he prepared his old mule in the lean-to, adjusting worn leather straps with practiced hands. He had just finished securing the saddle when Sophia appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl. "I want to come with you," she said firmly. Daniel frowned, pausing with a rope in his hands. "Trail's rough, deep snow. Won't be easy going." "I know it won't be easy," Sophia replied, lifting her chin. "But I need to learn about this land if I'm to stay here." Something in her determined expression made Daniel relent. He helped her bundle up in several layers of furs and pelts until she resembled a great brown bear, her cheeks flushed pink above the collar as she struggled to mount the mule. "Here now," Daniel said gruffly, making a stirrup with his hands. He braced himself as she stepped up, surprised by how lightly she moved despite her size. Once she was settled, he took the mule's lead rope and began breaking trail through the deep snow. The going was indeed slow. Drifts reached past Daniel's knees in places, and the mule had to carefully pick its way along. Sophia clung to the saddle horn, swaying with each step. Twice she nearly slipped off when the mule stumbled, but she managed to right herself with only a small gasp. "You're doing fine," Daniel found himself saying after her third near fall. "Old Jake here's sure-footed as they come." "I reckon he's got more sense than some men I've known," Sophia replied with a wry smile. Her joke caught Daniel off guard, and a short laugh escaped him before he could stop it. They reached the frozen creek by midday. Daniel helped Sophia dismount, then went to check the first trap while she gathered twigs for a fire. The trap held a plump beaver, its fur thick and prime for winter. He worked quickly to retrieve it, aware of Sophia watching with interest rather than squeamishness. "Good pelt," she observed as he finished. "Will it fetch much at market?" "Fair price," Daniel nodded, surprised again by her practical attitude. He got a small fire going, and they sat on a fallen log to share strips of jerky and hot coffee from his canteen. The winter silence wrapped around them, broken only by the crack of ice on the creek and the distant cry of a jay. Sophia stared into the flames, her face troubled. "I'm afraid," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of going back to town. The stares, the whispers, the mockery." She pulled her furs tighter. Even before. What happened? People were cruel about my size. Children would point and laugh. Women would turn away. Men would make sport of me. Daniel kept his eyes on the fire, but he listened. He heard the pain in her voice, the shame she carried like a heavy pack. He wanted to offer comfort, but found no words. Instead, he stayed silent, steady as the mountains around them, letting her speak her fear into the wilderness. The sun was sliding toward the horizon when they started back. Sophia's cheeks were red from cold and exertion, but her eyes were clearer, as if unburdening herself had lifted a weight. The return journey seemed easier, though Daniel noticed she was tiring. They reached the cabin at dusk. While Daniel tended to the mule, Sophia went inside to start supper. By the time he entered, she had fed his hound and was humming as she stirred the pot over the fire. The hymn was one he remembered from childhood, "Amazing Grace," and her clear voice filled the cabin with a warmth that went beyond the physical. Daniel sat in his usual chair, watching her move about the cabin with growing familiarity. The hound lay at her feet, thumping its tail whenever she passed. Something had changed during their day in the wilderness. He realized he had smiled more times today than he had in years, but even as he felt the warmth of their shared day, Daniel forced himself to remember she was temporary. Come spring, she would likely leave, seeking a better life than this rough cabin could provide. Best not to get too comfortable with her presence, he warned himself. Even as Sophia's hymn wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, he busied himself with cleaning his traps, trying to ignore how right it felt to have someone else moving about his home, how the cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The hound looked between them contentedly, already accepting what Daniel refused to acknowledge, that something was growing here, as steady and unstoppable as spring after winter. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight sparkling off the fresh snow. Daniel was stoking the fire when he heard it, the distinctive crunch of hoofbeats approaching through the crusty drifts. He moved swiftly to the window, breath fogging the cold glass as he peered out. A rider approached on a lean sorrel horse, his dark form stark against the white landscape. Daniel recognized him immediately, Rusk, a rancher known for his sharp deals and bitter temperament. The man's presence here, so far from his usual haunts, sent a chill through Daniel that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Sophia," Daniel said quietly, "stay inside." She looked up from where she was kneading bread dough, her hands dusty with flour. At his tone, her fingers stilled, and she nodded. Moving away from the window, Daniel stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close firmly behind him. Rusk dismounted, his boots hitting the packed snow with a heavy thud. His face was weathered, leather creased with meanness around the eyes and mouth. "Boone," Rusk called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Heard you got yourself some unexpected company. What brings you up this way, Rusk?" Daniel kept his voice neutral, though his hand instinctively moved closer to the rifle propped by the door. Rusk's thin lips curved in what might have been smile. "That woman in there, Sophia Whitlow. She was promised to me. Got papers to prove it, along with rights to her dowry money." He pulled off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh. "Come to collect what's mine." The door creaked open. Behind Daniel and Sophia emerged, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. Her face had gone pale, but she held herself straight. "I never promised myself to you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I don't know what papers you claim to have, but they're false." Rusk's eyes narrowed. "Money's real enough. Your pa set it aside special. Town's talking about how you run off up here instead of honoring your commitments." He took a step forward. "Time to come down and set things right." Daniel moved smoothly between them, She's not going anywhere. That. So? Rusk's voice dropped dangerously low. Folk might find it interesting, hearing how you're keeping her up here. Mighty scandalous tale, I reckon. Reputation's a fragile thing, breaks easy as ice on a spring creek. Get off my land. Daniel's words came out like chips of frozen stone. They stood locked in silence, steam rising from the sorrel's flanks, the mountain wind whispering through bare branches. Finally, Rusk pulled his gloves back on with deliberate slowness. This ain't finished, he said, swinging up into his saddle. Town'll hear about this, both of you. He wheeled his horse around, sending clumps of snow flying. Better decide what. Matters more pride or peace. They watched until he disappeared down the trail. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Sophia's composure crumbled. She sank onto the porch step, tears streaming down her face. He'll ruin everything, she whispered. The gossip, the scandal, it'll be worse than before. I can't bear it, not again. Daniel stood awkward and uncertain, a foreign feeling burning in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as anger, not the quick flash of temper he sometimes felt, but something deeper and more protective. The sight of Sophia's tears, the memory of Rusk's sneering threats, stirred something he thought long buried. No one's taken you anywhere, he said gruffly. Not unless you want to go. Sophia wiped her eyes with her shawl. Why are you protecting me? Daniel had no answer, so he just helped her up and led her back inside, where the bread dough still waited on the table and the fire sparked welcome warmth. That evening, after a quiet supper, Sophia sat in the circle of lamplight by the hearth. In her lap lay Daniel's old Bible, its cover worn and pulling away from the spine. He hadn't opened it in years, had almost forgotten its existence on the rough-hewn shelf. Her fingers moved carefully over the cracked leather, testing loose spots, measuring tears. From her sewing basket, she selected needle and thread, then began the patient work of repair. Each stitch was small and precise, binding the broken pieces back together. Daniel watched from his chair in the shadows, uncertain. Why the sight disturbed him so? It was just mending, like the work she did on his shirts and socks. But something about her careful handling of the book, the quiet reverence in her touch, stirred memories he'd tried to forget, of his mother's hands holding those same pages, of prayers spoken over suppers and sorrows, of a faith as natural as breathing. The lamplight caught the tears still drying on Sophia's cheeks, but her hands remained steady as she worked. Daniel felt the strange comfort of her presence warring with his instinct to keep his distance, to protect the solitude he'd built around himself like walls. The hound sighed in its sleep by the fire, and outside, the wind sang its endless mountain song. Inside, there was only the soft scratch of Sophia's needle and the weight of things unspoken between them. Winter's icy grip tightened on the mountains, and the stores in Daniel's cabin began to dwindle. The flour barrel echoed hollow when Sophia scraped its bottom, and the salt pork hung sparse in the smokehouse. Even with careful rationing, they couldn't stretch their supplies much longer. We need to make for town, Daniel announced one morning, his breath visible in the cold air as he came in from checking the animals. Mule can handle the trail if we're careful. Sophia looked up from darning socks by the fire. I'm coming with you, Daniel frowned. Might be better if you stayed. I won't hide forever, she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. Besides, you'll need help loading supplies. The next morning dawned bitter cold as they hitched the mule to the small sledge. Sophia wore every layer she owned, wrapped in a borrowed buffalo coat that barely closed around her. The journey down the mountain was slow and treacherous, the mule picking its way carefully through deep drifts while icy wind whipped at their faces. As they approached the settlement, Sophia's breathing quickened. Daniel heard her whispered prayers, carried away by the wind. The first buildings came into view, the smithy, the assayer's office. Then the main street with its wooden sidewalks piled with snow. Heads turned as they passed. Daniel felt the weight of stares, heard the murmurs ripple through the sparse crowd. A group of women outside the dry goods store whispered behind their hands, eyes fixed on Sophia's size and Daniel's presence beside her. "There's the mountain. Man's fat bride," someone called out, voice dripping with mockery. Heard she was too heavy for her first groom to carry her over the threshold. Sophia's shoulders hunched, but she kept her chin up as Daniel helped her down from the sledge. They made their way to the mercantile, where the bell above the door announced their entrance with cheerful indifference to the tension in the air. They were gathering their supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, when Rusk's tall frame filled the doorway, his cold eyes fixed on Sophia as he stepped inside. "Well, if it ain't the fat runaway bride herself," he announced loudly, his voice carrying through the store. "Come down from her mountain hiding place at last." The other customers fell silent, watching. Sophia's hands clutched at her shawl, her face flushing deep red. Daniel set down the sack of flour he was holding. His movement was deliberate as he turned to face Rusk. "That's enough." "Enough?" Rusk sneered. "Ain't nearly enough. Town's got a right to know about the woman you're keeping up there." "The woman," Daniel cut in, his quiet voice carrying steel, "is my lawful wife by a certificate bearing my name. She's proven herself honest and hardworking, which is more than I can say for some." His eyes locked with Rusk's. "Any man who'd mock a lady's misfortune ain't worth the boots he's standing in." The silence in the store grew thick. Rusk's face darkened, but something in Daniel's stance made him think better of pushing further. He spat on the floor and stalked out. Later, as winter afternoon light slanted through the windows of the small church, people gathered for the weekly service. Daniel hadn't planned to attend, but Sophia had asked so quietly, so hopefully, that he found himself sitting in the back pew beside her. When the preacher called for a hymn, Sophia rose. Daniel saw her hands shaking as she stepped forward, but her voice, when it came, filled the church with unexpected power and grace. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The pure notes soared to the rafters, carrying years of pain and hope in every word. One by one, others joined in. Gruff miners, weathered ranchers, proper town ladies. Their voices merged with Sophia's, lifting the old hymn until it seemed to shake the very walls. Daniel didn't sing, but something in his chest tightened as he watched Sophia lead the congregation. Her face glowed with inner light, all shame forgotten. In the joy of music, the townsfolk who had whispered and stared now looked at her with something like awe. When the service ended, several people came to thank her, including the preacher's wife, who pressed her hand warmly. The change in how they looked at her was subtle but unmistakable. Respect had replaced ridicule. The ride home was quiet but peaceful. The mule plodded steadily upward through the gathering dusk, loaded with supplies. Snow began to fall softly around them. "Thank you," Sophia said suddenly, "for what you said in the store." Daniel adjusted the reins. Wasn't nothing but truth. A smile touched Sophia's face, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her features, bringing a beauty that had nothing to do with size or shape. Daniel cleared his throat. "You've got courage, ma'am. Standing up there, singing like that. Ain't many would have done it." The smile stayed on her face all the way home, warm as lamplight against the gathering dark. The mountain winter settled into a steady rhythm, like the beating of a heart. Each morning, frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin's small window panes, and Daniel's boots crunched across fresh snow to the woodpile. Inside, Sophia stirred cornmeal mush over the fire, humming hymns that filled the single room with warmth. Daniel found himself watching her more often now, noting how she moved with growing confidence through their shared space. Her large frame no longer seemed awkward in the cabin's confines. She had learned to navigate around the rough furniture, to duck beneath the low-hanging dried herbs she'd strung from the rafters. "Reckon you ought to learn to shoot," Daniel said one clear morning, taking down his old Hawken rifle from its pegs. "Might need to defend yourself someday, with me out checking traps." Sophia's eyes widened. "I've never touched a firearm before. No time like now to start." He led her outside, where he'd set up some tin cans on a fallen log. The rifle looked enormous in her soft hands. Daniel stood behind her, adjusting her grip, showing her how to sight along the barrel. His chest brushed against her back as he demonstrated the proper stance. "Now squeeze gentle," he instructed, "like you're testing a peach for ripeness." The rifle cracked. The shot went wide, sending snow spraying from a tree trunk well above the targets. Sophia jumped at the recoil, then burst into laughter that echoed off the mountainside. "Lord have mercy," she gasped. "I'm about as accurate as a blind squirrel." Daniel found himself chuckling too, a rusty sound he barely recognized. "Takes practice. Try again." They spent an hour at it, Sophia growing more comfortable with the weapon, though her aim remained poor. Her determination impressed him. She didn't give up even when her shoulder grew sore from the recoil. The days fell into pattern. Daniel would check his trap lines while Sophia kept the cabin, making soap from ashes and tallow, mending clothes, cooking hearty stews that filled their bellies and warmed their spirits. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the hound sprawled between them, sharing stories of their lives before. "Pa had an apple orchard in Missouri," Sophia would say, her needle flashing as she darned socks. "Every fall, Ma would make the best apple butter you ever tasted. The whole house would smell like cinnamon for days." Daniel found himself speaking of things long buried, his mother's garden back east, the sister he'd lost to fever, the dreams he'd had before life turned harsh. Sophia listened without judgment, her quiet understanding drawing out words he thought he'd forgotten how to speak. One evening, she noticed him shivering as he came in from night chores. Without a word, she took his worn coat, examining the torn lining and frayed seams. "May I?" she asked, holding up needle and thread. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He watched as she worked, her stitches small and even, reinforcing weak spots, patching holes. When she handed it back, the coat felt stronger, warmer somehow. "Much obliged," he said softly. Their prayers had become a nightly ritual. Daniel hadn't prayed properly in years, but Sophia's simple faith stirred something in him. They would bow their heads, and her clear voice would lift up thanks for their daily bread, for safety for each other. One night, as they finished their prayers, Sophia tentatively placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light as a snowflake, but Daniel felt it burn through his sleeve. His first instinct was to pull away. Touch had been foreign to him for so long. But something made him stay still, accepting the gentle pressure of her fingers. Cabin had changed, he realized. The silence that had once pressed in like a weight now felt comfortable, shared. The single room no longer echoed with emptiness, but hummed with life, the crackle of the fire, Sophia's quiet movements, the hound's contented sighs. Yet beneath their growing peace lay an undercurrent of tension. Rusk's threats hung over them, like storm clouds. Daniel caught Sophia watching the trail sometimes, worry creasing her brow. She never spoke of it, but he knew she feared the bitter rancher's next move. Daniel found himself growing protective, checking the rifle was loaded. Before bed, listening sharp for hoofbeats when he worked outside. The thought of Rusk bringing harm to Sophia, of erasing the smile that had begun to light her face, stirred something fierce in his chest. But for now they had this, the quiet rhythm of shared days, the growing warmth between them, the subtle shift from strangers to something more. In the lamplight, Daniel watched Sophia's needle flash as she mended his Bible's worn cover, her touch as gentle with the sacred book as it had been with his coat. The cabin felt like home in a way it hadn't for years, and Daniel realized with startling clarity that he no longer thought of their arrangement as temporary. The mountain night pressed dark against the cabin windows. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Daniel sat cleaning his rifle while Sophia darned socks by lamplight, their comfortable silence broken only by the hound's soft snoring. The pounding came without warning, 3 sharp blows that rattled the door in its frame. The hound leaped up, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. "Who rides this late? Open up, Boone." Rusk's voice cut through the night air like a knife. "Got business with you." Sophia's face went pale. She set aside her mending, hands trembling. Daniel motioned her to stay back as he moved to the door, positioning himself so the thick wood would provide cover if needed. He cracked it open to find Rusk astride his horse, 2 rough-looking men flanking him. Moonlight glinted off their gun belts. Behind them, their mounts stamped restlessly in the snow, breath steaming in the cold air. "State your business and be gone," Daniel said, his voice hard as iron. Rusk pulled papers from his coat with a flourish. "Got here some interesting documents concerning that woman you're harboring." His smile was cruel in the darkness. "Seems she's promised to me, signed and witnessed. That dowry money's mine by right." "Those papers are lies," Sophia called out, her voice quavering but determined. She had moved to stand behind Daniel, one hand gripping the back of his shirt. "Shut your mouth, woman," one of Rusk's men spat. "Ain't your place to speak." Daniel's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. "Mind how you talk in my house." "Your house?" Rusk laughed, the sound echoing off the snowy peaks. "You're harboring another man's wife, Boone. That makes you a thief and her a—" The rifle came up smooth as silk, its barrel gleaming in the lamplight that spilled through the doorway. "Choose your next words careful," Daniel said quietly. "Might be the last ones you speak." A tense silence fell. The hired men's hands hovered near their gun belts, but Daniel's aim never wavered. He could feel Sophia trembling behind him, but her presence at his back steadied him somehow. Rusk's face twisted with rage. He brandished the papers again. "These say she's mine." "The law don't reach up here," Daniel cut in. "And those papers ain't worth the ink wasted on them. Now ride out while you still can." For a long moment, Rusk sat rigid in his saddle, hatred burning in his eyes. Then he slowly tucked the papers away. "This ain't over, Boone. Woman's got money. Coming to her, and I mean to have it." "She ain't got nothing that belongs to you," Daniel said. "Now get." Rusk wheeled his horse around. "You'll regret this," he snarled over his shoulder. His men followed, and soon the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. Daniel kept the rifle trained on the darkness until the last echo died away. When he finally lowered it and turned, he found Sophia had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Daniel set the rifle aside and knelt before her chair. Gently, he pulled her hands away from her face. Her cheeks were wet with tears. "Not your fault," he said softly. "None of this is your fault." She shook her head. If you hadn't come here, I'd still be alone with my bitterness," Daniel interrupted. "Living half a life." He took a deep breath, words he'd held back for weeks finally breaking free. "You belong here, Sophia. With me. Don't matter what papers Rusk waves or what folks might say." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but a smile trembled on her lips. "You mean that?" Daniel reached up and brushed a tear away with his thumb. "Reckon I do." She leaned into his touch, and for a long moment, they stayed that way, the fire crackling soft behind them. The hound came and laid his head on Sophia's knee, and she scratched his ears with her free hand. "What will we do?" she finally asked. "Whatever we must," Daniel answered. He rose and added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap up bright and strong. "But first, we pray." Together, they bowed their heads, And Sophia's voice rose clear and steady in the night. Lord, guide us through this valley. Give us strength to face what comes. And thank you for bringing me home. Daniel's quiet amen echoed in his heart like a promise. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountains. Daniel stood by the cabin door, adjusting his coat as Sophia wrapped a scarf around his neck with trembling hands. You'll be careful? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Always am. He checked his rifle and powder, avoiding her worried gaze. Hound will keep you safe while I'm gone. The dog wagged his tail at the mention, pressing close to Sophia's skirts. She'd already fed him extra scraps that morning. Seeking comfort in his steady presence, Daniel mounted his mule, the leather saddle creaking beneath him. Bar the door. After me. Don't open it for nobody. Sophia nodded, clutching her shawl tight against the morning chill. God go with you, she said softly. He touched the brim of his hat in response and urged the mule forward. Looking back once, he saw her standing in the doorway, the hound at her side, both watching him disappear into the pine forest. The ride to town took longer than usual. Fresh snow had drifted across the trail, and Daniel's thoughts were as heavy as the clouds hanging over the peaks. He couldn't shake the memory of Rusk's threats or the fear in Sophia's eyes. The settlement came into view near midday. A scatter of wooden buildings hunched against the mountainside. Smoke rose straight from chimneys in the still air. Daniel tied his mule outside the small church, its weathered cross standing stark against the sky. Inside, he found Preacher Matthews organizing hymnals. The old man looked up, recognition crossing his lined face. Daniel Boone, he said, setting aside the books. Been expecting you'd come. Need to know about a marriage certificate, Daniel said, removing his hat. When you signed in my name some weeks back, the preacher's expression grew grave. I remember it well. He moved to a worn desk and pulled out a leather-bound registry. Young fellow came in, said he was Daniel Boone's proxy for a correspondence marriage. Had all the right papers, or so I thought. Daniel's jaw tightened. Man was a gambler. Used my name to dodge his debts. Lord have mercy. The preacher shook his head. But the certificate itself, that's legal and binding. I signed it proper, with witnesses. He looked up sharply. The bride, she found you? She did. Daniel didn't elaborate on the circumstances. Man named Rusk's claiming rights to her dowry. Shows up at my cabin with forged papers. The preacher's face darkened. Thomas Rusk's a snake. Been trying to get his hands on every penny that comes through these mountains. He stood straighter, determination filling his voice. I'll testify to the truth of that certificate, Daniel. Before any judge you need. That woman's your legal wife. Relief and something deeper stirred in Daniel's chest. Much obliged, preacher. How? Is she? The old man asked gently. I remember her letters before the marriage. Seemed a good Christian woman. Daniel thought of Sophia's hymns filling his cabin, her quiet strength in the face of mockery. She is that, he said softly. The ride home seemed longer still. The sun was setting by the time Daniel spotted smoke from his chimney rising through the trees. His chest tightened at the sight. He'd never before had such a welcome waiting dot as he approached. The cabin door flew open. Sophia rushed out, the hound bounding ahead of her. Daniel, I was so worried. He dismounted, legs stiff from the cold ride. Told you I'd return. I know, but she twisted her hands in her apron. Part of me feared you might decide it wasn't worth the trouble. That you just ride on. Daniel turned from tending his mule, really looking at her. Her face was drawn with anxiety, but her eyes held such hope it made his throat tight. Come inside, she said quickly. I've kept supper warm. The cabin was bright with lamplight and rich with the smell of stewed rabbit. As Daniel hung his coat, he noticed fresh swept floors, mended curtains, the table set with care. Sophia had kept busy in her worry. She served him silently, waiting until he'd eaten before asking, "What did the preacher say?" Daniel laid down his spoon. Reaching across the table, he covered her hand with his own work-roughened one. Her fingers were warm from cooking, and they trembled slightly under his touch. "Certificate's legal," he said. "Preacher remembers signing it proper, says he'll testify if needed." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "So I'm truly your wife?" "You are." He squeezed her hand gently. "And I aim to honor that. Even with all the trouble I've brought, Sophia." He waited until she met his gaze. "Time was I thought trust was a fool's game. Lived alone because it seemed safer." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But having you here, it's taught me different." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I trust you too," she whispered. "More than I've ever trusted anyone." The fire crackled in the hearth, and the hound sighed contentedly at their feet. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, something warm and true was growing between them, stronger than any winter storm. The morning of the court hearing dawned bitter cold. Daniel watched as Sophia pulled on her warmest dress, her hands shaking as she fastened each button. "You can stay here," he offered quietly. "No need to face their stares." Sophia lifted her chin, though fear flickered in her eyes. "I won't hide like I'm ashamed. Whatever comes, we face it together." Daniel nodded, respecting her courage. He helped her mount the mule, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. The ride into town was slow, frost crackling under the mule's hooves. Sophia held tight to Daniel's waist, her warmth steady against his back. As they entered the settlement, townsfolk stopped to stare. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men stepped aside, some nodding respectfully to Daniel, others averting their eyes. Sophia kept her head high, though Daniel felt her trembling. "Look at her, riding bold as you please," a woman's voice carried across the street. "And him, taking in another man's bride." Daniel's jaw tightened, but Sophia squeezed his arm. "There. Words can't hurt me now," she whispered. "Not when I know who I am." They dismounted outside the courthouse, a square wooden building with fresh-swept steps. Daniel offered his arm, and Sophia took it, her grip firm despite her shaking. Inside, the courtroom was already filling with curious onlookers. Judge Timmons sat behind his heavy desk, his gray beard neatly trimmed, eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. He shuffled through papers as Daniel and Sophia took their seats in the front row. The door banged open. Thomas Rusk strode in, boots clicking on the wooden floor. His fancy vest stretched tight across his chest, and a smirk played at his lips as he dropped a stack of papers on the judge's desk. "Your Honor," Rusk announced, "I've brought proof that Sophia Whitlow was promised to me, along with her dowry." "Money," he shot a cruel glance at Sophia. "Whatever game she's playing with Boone, she's legally bound elsewhere." Judge Timmons picked up the papers, examining them with narrowed eyes. "These claims seem rather convenient, Mr. Rusk." "They're properly signed and witnessed," Rusk insisted, his confidence wavering slightly under the judge's steady gaze. "Indeed." The judge set the papers aside. "Mrs. Whitlow, do you have anything to say about these documents?" Sophia stood slowly, her hands twisted in her skirts, but her voice rang clear through the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, I never promised myself to Thomas Rusk. I came west as a correspondent's bride, yes, but when that failed." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "Providence led me to Daniel Boone's door. He took me in when others would have left me to die. He's treated me with nothing but respect." Her voice grew stronger. "I am Daniel Boone's lawful wife, and he has never once shamed me. Whatever papers Mr. Rusk holds, they're as false as his claims." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel watched Sophia with pride, seeing not the frightened woman who'd appeared at his door, but a wife standing tall in her truth. "Mr. Boone?" The judge turned to Daniel. "Your response?" Daniel rose, holding their worn family Bible. "Got only two things to say, Your Honor. First, this certificate, signed proper by Preacher Matthews." He opened the Bible carefully, removing the folded paper. "Second's my word that I mean to honor it." Preacher Matthews stepped forward then, his aged voice steady. "I can testify to that certificate, Your Honor. Signed it myself, though I was deceived about the groom at the time. But the law is clear, it's binding on Daniel Boone's name." Judge Timmons studied the certificate, comparing it to Rusk's papers. His frown deepened as he examined the signatures. "This requires further investigation," he announced finally. "I'm postponing my ruling until these documents can be properly verified." He fixed Rusk with a stern look. "And I suggest all parties remember that false claims in my court carry serious consequences." Rusk's face darkened. He snatched up his hat and stormed out, leaving a wake of whispers. The judge gathered his papers. "Court will reconvene in 1 week's time. Mrs. Boone, you remain under your husband's protection until then." Sophia sagged slightly with relief. Daniel steadied her with a gentle hand at her elbow as they made their way out of the courthouse. The winter sun was bright on the snow, making her blink back tears. "Did you mean it?" Daniel asked quietly as they walked to their mule. "About never being shamed?" Sophia looked up at him, her eyes clear and honest. "Every word. Whatever the judge decides, I know where I belong now." Daniel helped her mount, noting how the townsfolk stares had changed, less scorn now, more thoughtful. Consideration. Perhaps they'd seen what he had, not just a woman seeking shelter, but a wife claiming her place with dignity and truth. They rode home in companionable silence, the uncertainty of the judge's postponement hanging between them like the winter mist over the mountains. Back at their mountain cabin, Daniel paced before the fireplace, his boots wearing a path in the wooden floor. The judge's delay gnawed at him like a trapped wolf. Sophia watched from her chair, her hands busy with mending but her eyes following his restless movement. What if Rusk's forged papers fooled the judge? Daniel muttered, more to himself than to her. "Man's got money for fancy lawyers." "The truth will stand," Sophia said softly, though worry lined her face. "We must trust in that." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the cabin's log walls. Daniel peered through the window at heavy clouds rolling in from the west. Fresh snow began to fall, thick flakes swirling in the gathering dusk. "Storm's coming," he announced, grabbing his coat. "Best get more wood inside while we can." Together they stacked logs in the lean-to until their fingers numbed with cold. By nightfall, snow had sealed them in, banking against the cabin walls. The familiar sound of wind and crackling fire filled their single room, but now it felt less lonely than before. Over the next days, they fell into a rhythm born of necessity and growing comfort. Sophia took charge of their dwindling supplies, stretching what remained with careful planning. She showed Daniel how to make biscuits that didn't crack teeth, though his first attempts brought laughter to them both. "Never thought I'd see Daniel Boone covered in flour," she teased, reaching up to brush white powder from his beard. Her touch lingered, and Daniel found himself leaning into it before catching himself and stepping back to tend the fire. In evenings, they sat together while Sophia read aloud from his mother's old Bible. Her voice gave life to passages he'd forgotten, speaking of mercy and providence. Daniel listened, remembering how his ma used to read those same words when he was small. One night, watching Sophia shift uncomfortably on her makeshift pallet, Daniel made a decision. The next morning, he dragged in fresh-cut pine logs and began working them with saw and plane. "What are you making?" Sophia asked, bringing him coffee. "Proper bed frame," he answered, measuring carefully. "Can't have my wife sleeping on the floor like a vagrant." The words slipped out natural as breathing. "My wife." Sophia's cheeks flushed pink, but her smile could have lit the cabin brighter than any lamp. It took 2 days of careful work. Daniel shaped each piece with attention that spoke louder than words. Tenons fitting precisely into mortises, rails sanded smooth, everything level and strong. When finished, the bed stood solid in the corner, ready for the thick mattress Sophia had prepared. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her hand along the polished headboard. "Thank you, Daniel." That evening, as snow continued falling outside, they sat closer than usual by the fire. The hound dozed at their feet while Sophia read from Psalms, her voice warm in the fire-lit room. Daniel found himself mouthing the familiar words along with her. "Would you?" Sophia hesitated, then continued softly. "Would you pray with me, Daniel?" He stiffened slightly. "Been years since I prayed proper. Might not remember how." "God doesn't mind simple words," she encouraged. "Just speak what's in your heart." Daniel stared into the flames, feeling the weight of years of silence. Then slowly, haltingly, he began to pray. "Lord," his voice was rough, "with disuse. Been a long time since I talked to you. Reckon I got angry, turned my back, but..." He glanced at Sophia, drawing strength from her presence. "You sent this good woman to my door. Don't know why you'd trust me with such a gift, but I'm asking now. Help us find a way through this trouble. Help me be the man she deserves." Sophia's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "Amen," she whispered, tears gleaming in her eyes. Something shifted in the cabin that night, as if Daniel's prayer had opened a door long rusted shut. The fire seemed warmer, the shadows softer. Even the storm's howl became a gentle reminder of their sanctuary together. Later, as Sophia settled into her new bed and Daniel made up his pallet by the fire, the cabin glowed with something beyond mere firelight. It was the warmth of two hearts finding their way back to faith, back to trust, back to the possibility of love. "Good night, Daniel," Sophia called softly. "Good night," he answered, and for the first time in years added, "God willing, we'll see morning together." The snow continued falling outside, but inside their cabin, winter's chill had no power against the warmth they'd found in shared prayer and quiet understanding. The winter's icy grip finally loosened its hold on the mountains. Melting snow dripped from the cabin's eaves in steady streams, and patches of muddy ground emerged beneath the dwindling drifts. Daniel stood at his doorway, watching the morning sun break through clouds that had shrouded the peaks for weeks. Sound of multiple horses splashing through spring mud caught his attention. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Sophia's gentle touch stayed him. "Look," she said, pointing. "It's Reverend Matthews leading them." A group of townsfolk approached on horseback, their faces bright with purpose. Daniel recognized the merchant's wife, 2 miners who'd heard Sophia sing in church, and several others who'd been present at the courthouse. His shoulders tensed, years of isolation making him wary of crowds. The Reverend dismounted first, his boots squelching in the mud. "Brother Daniel, Sister Sophia," he called out, smiling broadly. "We bring good news from Judge Timmons." Sophia's fingers tightened on Daniel's arm. He covered her hand with his own, steadying them both as the group gathered at their door. "The judge has ruled," the merchant's wife announced, practically bouncing with excitement. "He declared your marriage certificate binding and legal. Rusk's claims were thrown out entirely. The judge said he'd never seen such obvious forgeries," added one of the miners, spitting in disgust. "Called them an insult to the court's intelligence." The Reverend nodded solemnly. When Rusk heard the verdict, he stormed out of town like a man possessed. Last anyone saw, he was heading east, likely for good. Sophia's legs gave way. Daniel caught her as she sank down, tears streaming freely down her face. For once, he didn't care who watched as he held her close, his own eyes burning with unexpected moisture. "Thank you," Sophia managed between sobs. "Thank you all for coming to tell us." The townsfolk didn't stay long, sensing the couple's need for privacy. They left a basket of celebration gifts, fresh bread, preserves, even a small cake along. With their warm wishes, after they'd gone, Daniel and Sophia stood together in their doorway, watching the riders disappear down the muddy trail. The spring air felt clean and new in their lungs. "It's really over," Sophia whispered, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "Reckon so," Daniel agreed, his voice rough with emotion. He kept his arm around her waist, no longer feeling any need to maintain distance. That evening, Sophia prepared a special meal of venison stew, using the last of their winter meat. The cabin filled with rich aromas as she added wild onions and early spring herbs she'd dried last fall. Daniel watched her move about their home with quiet grace, remembering the desperate night she'd first arrived. They sat close together at their small table, sharing fresh bread and stew. The hound dozed contentedly by the hearth, and lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls. Everything felt different now, settled, rightful, blessed. "Never thought I'd have this again," Daniel said softly, looking around the cabin that had once felt so empty. "A real home. You've filled it with life, Sophia, with prayer and song, and—" he paused, searching for words, "with love." Sophia's eyes welled up again, but her smile was radiant. "When they abandoned me in that storm, I thought I'd die alone. Mocked and unwanted, just like always." She reached across the table to take his hand, but God had other plans. He led me to your door, to the one man who could see past my size to who I really am. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Daniel agreed, surprising himself by quoting scripture. "Reckon he knew what he was doing, sending you to me. Needed someone to thaw out this frozen old heart." "Not so frozen anymore," Sophia said softly, squeezing his hand. They sat in comfortable silence, finishing their meal as darkness settled outside. The spring peepers had started their evening chorus, a sound of renewal and hope after the long winter. "I can see his hand in all of it now," Daniel mused, still holding Sophia's hand. "Even in the pain that drove me up here alone, he was preparing a place, waiting for the right time to bring us together." Sophia nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And now we have a chance to build something beautiful. Something neither of us thought we'd ever find." The cabin that had once been Daniel's fortress of solitude had transformed into a true home, filled with warmth and shared faith. As they cleared the table together, their movements in easy harmony, both felt the rightness of their union, not just by law now, but in their hearts. Outside, the last snow continued melting from the mountainside, making way for new growth. Inside, two souls once wounded by the world's cruelty had found healing in each other, brought together by providence and bound now by love as well as law. The mountain spring arrived with gentle determination, melting snow into rivulets that fed the awakening earth. Daniel stood beside Sophia in a cleared patch of ground near the cabin, his calloused hands guiding hers as they worked the soil. "Like this," he murmured, showing her how to create shallow furrows. "Seeds need room to stretch their roots." Sophia nodded, concentrating as she dropped tiny carrot seeds into the dark earth. Together, they tackled the winter's damage to the cabin. Daniel steadied the ladder while Sophia handed up fresh shingles, their teamwork making quick work of the repairs. The old hound circled below, barking at rabbits that dared venture near their homestead. Each time the dog gave chase, Sophia's laughter rang out across the clearing, clear as mountain stream water. One afternoon, Daniel led Sophia to the woodshed where he'd been working in secret. There stood a rocking chair, lovingly carved from sturdy pine. He'd made it extra wide and strong, crafted specially for her comfort. "It's yours," he said simply, helping her settle into it. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she ran her hands over the smooth armrests. Daniel knelt beside the chair, taking her hand in his. "You're home now," he promised softly. "And I'll never let anyone drive you away." The first rays of sunlight painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and rose. Morning dew sparkled on tender shoots pushing through the freshly turned soil of their small garden. Sophia knelt between the rows, her capable hands gently tending to young plants, while her clear voice lifted in song across the peaceful mountainside. Daniel approached from the creek, water buckets balanced across his shoulders. He paused, watching his wife work. Her melody, once timid and uncertain, now rang strong and joyful through the crisp morning air. The old hound dozed contentedly on the cabin's wooden porch, while wisps of cooking smoke curled up from the stone chimney into the kosho. Crystal clear sky. Setting down the buckets, Daniel crossed to where Sophia worked. He reached for her hand, helping her to her feet. His weathered face softened as he looked into her eyes. "This place was never home until you," he said quietly, drawing her close. They stood embracing as dawn light spilled across the highlands, turning the peaks to gleaming silver. For the first time in countless seasons, Daniel's heart swelled with visions of the future, of children's laughter echoing through these hills, of prayers shared by firelight, of a family growing strong together in faith and love. The solitary mountain man who had turned away from the world now held his whole world in his arms. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.